The snow had buried the ridge 6 feet deep, covering doors and windows of every cabin for miles. But Callum Bairn walked out his entrance without lifting a shovel, because the tilted room attached to his cabin had no snow on it at all. What he built in the 8 months after his partner died, crushed beneath a collapsed roof, would change how mountain men survived on high ridges across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an innovation even more unbelievable than this one. The roof logs had fallen inward, creating a collapsed V-shape that left no doubt about what had happened. Callum Bairn stood in the snow outside what remained of Dougal MacNeil's cabin and understood immediately that his trapping partner was dead inside. The structure had stood for 3 winters without issue, but the blizzard that had hit the ridge 3 days earlier had dumped snow in quantities that exceeded anything Callum had seen in his 7 years working these mountains. He had been checking trap lines 5 miles east when the storm hit. By the time he returned, the damage was complete. Callum spent an hour digging through the snow and shattered logs to reach Dougal's body. His partner had died quickly, crushed beneath the central ridge beam when it gave way under the accumulated weight. There had been no chance to escape, no time to react. Callum pulled the body free and dragged it to a clearing 50 yards upslope, where the wind had scoured the snow down to exposed rock. He buried Dougal there, using rocks to cover the grave, because the ground was frozen too solid to dig. The work took most of the afternoon. By the time Callum finished, the winter sun was dropping behind the western peaks. He stood at the grave and tried to process what had happened. Dougal MacNeil had survived grisly encounters, frozen creek crossings, a fall that broke his collarbone, and countless other dangers that killed men regularly in the fur trade. He had died because a roof could not hold snow. Callum walked back to his own cabin, a quarter-mile south along the ridge. The structure was identical to the one that had killed Dougal. Same basic design, same materials, same construction methods. They had built both cabins together 2 autumns earlier, using techniques every mountain man knew. Notched log corners, peaked roof, moss chinked between gaps, single door, 1 small window. The cabins had seemed adequate at the time, but standing outside his cabin in the fading light, Callum saw it differently. The roof was already sagging slightly under the weight of snow accumulated during the 3-day storm. Not enough to fail yet, but the warning was clear. He climbed onto a stump and used his knife to probe the snow depth on the roof. Nearly 4 feet of heavy, wet snow sat on logs never designed to bear such weight. Callum went inside and built a fire in the stone hearth. He sat on his sleeping platform and stared at the ceiling logs, imagining them falling inward the way Dougal's had. The cabin was warm, it was dry, it was functional in every way except the one that mattered most. If another storm like the last one hit, the roof would fail. Not might fail, would fail. Most men would have accepted this reality as the cost of living on a high ridge during winter. Mountains were dangerous. Cabins sometimes collapsed. Partners died. But something shifted in Callum that night as he sat alone in a cabin identical to the one that had killed his friend. He could not accept that roof collapse was inevitable. There had to be a way to build shelter that could withstand the snow loads that came with ridge living, and if no one else had figured it out, he would. Callum stayed on the ridge through the rest of that winter, but he stopped trapping. The furs that would have brought money in St. Louis no longer mattered. He spent his days watching snow. Other trappers who passed through his camp thought grief had broken his mind. They saw him standing on exposed ridges with a plumb line and string, measuring angles against rock faces. They saw him marking snow depths on trees with charcoal. They saw him sitting motionless for hours, staring at how snow accumulated on different surfaces. He was not broken. He was studying a problem no one else had considered worth solving. Snow behaved according to principles that trappers accepted but never examined. It piled on flat surfaces. It slid off steep ones. The question was where the transition happened and whether that transition point could be used to prevent accumulation entirely. Callum began with observation. The ridge peak itself stayed relatively clear even during heavy storms. Wind played a role, scouring snow away. But that was not the complete explanation. The peak's geometry mattered. Sharp angles did not hold snow even when wind was calm. He found rock outcroppings where one face would be buried under 2 feet of accumulation, while the adjacent face, angled differently, remained bare. He made a measuring tool from a straight branch and string weighted with a stone. Using this improvised inclinometer, he measured the angles of surfaces that held snow versus those that shed it. Flat surfaces accumulated endlessly. Gentle slopes up to about 30 degrees still built dangerous loads. But surfaces steeper than 40 degrees shed snow almost immediately. The steeper the angle beyond 40 degrees, the faster snow slid away. The pattern held across different snow conditions. Dry powder behaved slightly different from wet snow, but the principle remained consistent. There was a critical angle beyond which accumulation became impossible. Gravity pulled snow downward faster than it could compact and adhere to the surface. Callum tested this by building small wooden frames at various angles and watching how snow behaved on them during storms. A frame angled at 30 degrees accumulated snow that compressed into dense mass. A frame at 45 degrees stayed clear. Snow landed and slid off within seconds, leaving the surface exposed. Other trappers stopped bothering to speak to him. Fergus Drummond rode past one afternoon and saw Callum placing angled boards in a clearing. Fergus shook his head and kept riding. The story spread through the scattered trapping community. Callum Bairn had lost his mind after Dougal died. He was playing with sticks and string instead of working his trap lines. Give him until spring, and he would either recover or starve. But Callum was not playing. He was documenting principles that would save lives. By the time winter ended, he had filled bark sheets with measurements and observations. He knew the exact angle needed to prevent snow accumulation. He knew that wind assistance was helpful, but not necessary. He knew that a surface angled at 45 degrees in his region would remain clear through any storm the mountains could produce. What he did not yet know was how to build a livable structure using that angle. That problem would consume his entire summer. Spring thaw came in late April of 1841, turning the ridge into a landscape of running water and exposed mud. Callum spent the first weeks of thaw sitting inside his cabin sketching designs on pieces of bark using charcoal from his fire. The designs made no sense by any conventional standard of frontier construction. They showed a structure that defied everything trappers knew about building shelter in the mountains. The core concept was simple, but appeared impossible to execute. If a surface angled steeper than 40 degrees would not hold snow, then a structure where every surface exceeded that angle would never accumulate dangerous weight. The problem was that people could not live on surfaces angled at 45 degrees. Floors needed to be flat. Walls needed to be vertical or close to it. A cabin built entirely at steep angles would be uninhabitable. Callum's solution was to combine two structures. A conventional cabin would provide flat floors and vertical walls for living. Attached to this main cabin would be a second structure, a room built as a perfect cube but rotated 45 degrees so that every surface was angled steeply enough to shed snow. The tilted cube would be cantilevered from the main cabin, extending outward and upward with no snow-bearing surfaces at all. The concept seemed absurd. Callum had no formal training in architecture or engineering. What he had was observation of how nature solved similar problems. He spent days studying trees, particularly how branches extended far from trunks while supporting significant weight. The principle was counterbalance. A heavy branch extending in one direction was balanced by the tree's mass and other branches extending opposite directions. The leverage worked because the connection point was strong and the opposing forces were in equilibrium. He could apply the same principle to his tilted cube. If the main cabin was built heavy enough, it could counterbalance the weight of a lighter structure extending from one side. The connection between the two would need to be extraordinarily strong, distributing force across multiple points rather than concentrating stress at a single joint. Callum sketched variations for weeks. Some designs showed the tilted cube attached at ground level. Others showed it elevated, cantilevered from the upper portion of the main cabin wall. He calculated rough weights using what he knew about log construction versus lighter timber frame methods. The tilted cube could not be solid logs. It would be too heavy. Instead, it would need to be timber frame construction with plank siding, creating an enclosed space that was weatherproof but significantly lighter than traditional log walls. The window placement solved itself once he visualized the cube properly rotated. One face would angle upward, perfect for a large window that would capture light while remaining too steep for snow accumulation. The window would provide visibility and ventilation that traditional cabin windows could not match. By early May, Callum had a design he believed would work. It looked ridiculous on bark sketches. A conventional cabin with a tilted box jutting from one side, the box rotated to diamond orientation, but the mathematics were sound. The geometry would prevent snow accumulation. The cantilever would hold if properly engineered. Now he needed materials and the courage to build something no one had attempted before. Callum left the ridge in late May and rode 3 weeks southeast to Fort Union, the largest trading post in the northern Rockies. He carried his season's furs, a modest catch since he had barely worked his trap lines during the winter tatter. The furs brought enough money for what he needed, but not much excess. Every dollar would go toward materials that made no sense to anyone watching him purchase them. At the fort's supply warehouse, he bought items that confused the trader. 16 iron brackets designed for barn construction, each L-shaped and measuring 8 inches on both sides. 4 iron tension rods, 3 feet long and threaded on both ends with nuts. 2 dozen milled planks, light pine cut to uniform thickness, far more expensive than rough-hewn lumber. A spirit level, a tool most trappers never owned. Heavy bolts, specialized drill bits, and a plane for shaping wood to precise dimensions. The trader asked what he was building. Callum said, "A cabin." The trader looked at the materials and said these supplies were for fine construction, not mountain shelter. Callum paid and arranged for everything to be wrapped for transport. Outside the warehouse, he encountered Fergus Drummond, another trapper who worked ridges 30 miles west of Callum's location. Fergus had known Dougal and had heard about the roof collapse. He expressed brief condolences, then asked about Callum's unusual purchases. Callum explained in simple terms. He was building a cabin addition designed so snow could not accumulate on it. The addition would be a tilted cube angled at 45 degrees, cantilevered from a main cabin structure. Fergus stared at him. "A tilted cube? You mean like a box sitting crooked?" "Rotated 45 degrees on all axes," Callum said. "Every surface too steep to hold snow," Fergus laughed. "That'll topple in the first windstorm. Cantilevers work with stone, Bairn, not wood. You are wasting your money on a design that cannot stand." Other trappers gathered as word spread about the absurd plan. They offered opinions freely. The tilted structure would create wind resistance that would tear it from the cabin. The weight distribution would be impossible to balance. The materials were too fine for mountain conditions. Callum was building a church when he needed a shelter. The consensus was clear. Grief had driven him to foolishness. Thomas McAdams, an older trapper who had worked the Rockies for 20 years, pulled Callum aside. "I knew Dougal. Good man. Terrible way to die. But you cannot fix what happened by building something impossible. Cabins collapse sometimes. It is the cost of living high." Callum thanked him for the concern and loaded his materials onto 3 pack horses. The journey back to the ridge took 4 weeks because the loaded animals moved slowly. He traveled alone, which gave him time to doubt everything. The materials had cost nearly all his money. If the design failed, he would have wasted a year's work and proven every skeptic correct. But doubt was just noise. He knew the mathematics were sound. The mockery did not matter. The structure would either stand or fall based on engineering, not opinion. Callum reached the ridge in early July of 1841 and began construction immediately. The design required 2 structures working as a single system, so he started with the main cabin. This would not be a typical mountain shelter. It needed to be heavier and stronger than standard construction because it would serve as the counterweight and anchor for the tilted cube. He selected a building site on high ground with clear sight lines and good drainage. The location put him 50 yards from the nearest water source, but the trade-off was worth it. He needed stable ground that would not shift under uneven loading. The foundation came first. Most trappers built directly on cleared ground, accepting that cabins would settle and shift over time. Callum dug a trench 18 inches deep around the cabin's perimeter and filled it with rocks, creating a level base that distributed weight evenly. He used his spirit level obsessively, checking every section until the foundation was perfectly flat. The work took a week. For the walls, he cut logs larger than necessary. Where a standard cabin used logs 10 to 12 inches in diameter, Callum selected 14-inch logs, adding mass that would help counterbalance the cantilevered addition. He notched the corners carefully and stacked them with precision, checking level and plumb constantly. The corner where the tilted cube would attach received special attention. He doubled the logs at this point, creating a reinforced section twice as thick as the rest of the wall. Into these doubled logs, he mortised slots for the iron brackets he had purchased at Fort Union. The brackets would be embedded directly into the log structure, creating connection points that were part of the wall itself rather than attachments added later. On the opposite side of the cabin from where the cube would extend, Callum built his stone fireplace and chimney. The stones added significant weight to that side of the structure, helping balance the load that would eventually cantilever from the opposite wall. He built the chimney heavy and tall, using more stone than necessary for a cabin this size. Every pound mattered for the equilibrium he was creating. The roof went on using standard methods, but again oversized. The ridge beam was thicker than needed. The support logs were spaced closer together. He was not trying to build a roof that could hold unlimited snow. He was building mass that would anchor the tilted addition. By mid-August, the main cabin was complete. It looked like a standard log structure, perhaps slightly larger and heavier than most, but nothing remarkable. Trappers who passed through saw nothing unusual. They did not understand that every aspect of the cabin had been engineered for a purpose they could not yet see. Callum moved his supplies inside and began preparing for the second phase of construction. The tilted cube would go up next, and that was where his design would either prove itself or collapse into expensive failure. He spent 3 days reviewing his bark sketches and checking measurements. The mathematics still held. The angles were correct. The counterbalance should work. Now he had to build it. The tilted cube could not be built in place. The geometry was too complex to assemble while cantilevered at 45 degrees. Callum's solution was to build the timber frame on the ground, test its structural integrity, then disassemble it and raise the components piece by piece to attach them to the main cabin. He started by cutting the frame members from straight pine logs, shaping them with his plane until they were uniform in dimension. Each piece was marked with charcoal to indicate its position in the final assembly. The frame used mortise and tenon joints reinforced with the iron brackets, creating connections far stronger than simple nailed joints. The cube measured 8 feet on each side, large enough to function as a room, but light enough to cantilever safely. Callum assembled it flat on the ground first, building one face at a time and connecting them with careful joinery. When the frame was complete, he lifted it with help from a pulley system he rigged to a tall pine near the cabin. The test was to see if the frame held its shape when suspended. It did. He disassembled the frame and began the process of raising it in sections. The bottom edge of the cube would attach to the reinforced cabin wall approximately 4 feet above ground level. From there, it would extend outward and upward at the critical 45-degree angle. The first pieces to go up were the primary support beams that would bear most of the cantilevered load. These beams connected to the iron brackets he had embedded in the cabin wall. The brackets were not surface-mounted. They extended through the logs, with bolts passing completely through the wall thickness and clinched on the interior side. To remove these connections, someone would have to destroy the wall itself. Once the primary beams were secured, Callum added the remaining frame pieces, working methodically to maintain the 45-degree rotation. The geometry created unusual angles at every joint, requiring custom fitting that could not be rushed. Each connection needed to be precise because the tilted orientation meant gravity was pulling on every joint from unexpected directions. The frame took 3 weeks to fully assemble in its cantilevered position. When it was complete, Callum removed the temporary support posts he had used during construction. The frame held perfectly, suspended by the connection to the main cabin wall with no sagging or rotation. The vertical plank siding went on next. He had bought milled planks specifically for this purpose. They were light, uniform, and could be fitted tightly to create weatherproof walls. He attached them to the frame using the same careful joinery he had employed throughout, making sure each plank was plumb relative to the tilted structure's own geometry. The window opening was cut into the upward-facing side of the cube. Callum framed it with doubled timbers and installed a multi-pane window he had transported carefully from Fort Union. The window was angled to the sky, positioned to capture maximum light while remaining steep enough to shed any snow that might land on it. By late September, the tilted cube had walls and a window. It looked exactly as absurd as the trappers had predicted. The critical engineering challenge was not whether the tilted cube could exist as a structure. It was whether the connection between the cube and main cabin could handle the forces involved without failing. Callum spent the first week of October addressing this problem with a solution that was invisible from outside but essential to the design's success. Inside the main cabin, he built a bracing system that connected the cantilevered cube's attachment points to the opposite wall. The braces were heavy timbers angled diagonally across the interior space, creating triangular load paths that distributed the cube's weight across the entire cabin structure rather than concentrating it at the connection points. The braces were bolted to the reinforced wall section where the cube attached and to the wall containing the stone fireplace, tying the 2 sides of the cabin together in rigid connection. The iron tension rods he had purchased at Fort Union served a specific purpose in this system. He drilled holes through the cabin walls and passed the threaded rods completely through the structure, with one end anchored near the cube attachment and the other end extending through the opposite wall. Heavy washers and nuts on both ends allowed him to tighten the rods, creating compression across the entire width of the cabin that resisted any tendency for the cube to rotate or pull away from its mounting points. The system worked on a principle Callum had observed in bridge construction during his youth in Scotland. Tension and compression forces could be balanced to create stability that neither force could achieve alone. The cube's weight created a downward and outward pulling force on the attachment points. The tension rods and internal bracing converted that pulling force into compression across the cabin's structure, which the heavy log walls could resist easily. To test the system, Callum loaded the interior of the tilted cube with rocks, adding weight that exceeded what the finished room would contain with furnishings and a person inside. He climbed into the main cabin's loft space and examined the connection points for any sign of movement or stress. Nothing shifted. The cube hung solid and stable. He removed the rocks and completed the interior finishing of the tilted room. A wooden floor was installed level relative to the cube's own geometry, which meant it sat at 45 degrees relative to true horizontal. Callum built a small platform inside that was actually level, creating a usable space within the tilted structure. Shelving went up on the walls, each shelf angled to account for the room's orientation. The final construction task was sealing every gap and joint to make the structure weatherproof. He used oakum and pine tar to caulk between planks, creating seals that would prevent wind and moisture penetration. The window was fitted with careful attention to the angled frame, ensuring no gaps existed where water could enter. By late October, the construction was complete. Callum moved his supplies into the main cabin and began preparing for winter. The tilted cube stood ready for its first test. Neighbors who saw the finished structure shook their heads. Fergus Drummond rode past and called out a prediction. "It will be kindling by Christmas, Bairn." The first snow came in early November, a light dusting that melted within days. Callum watched how it behaved on his tilted cube. Snow landed on the angled surfaces and slid off within hours, leaving the planks exposed while the main cabin's peaked roof retained a thin white layer. The principle worked exactly as his spring observations had predicted. December brought heavier storms. Snow accumulated 2 feet deep around the cabin, drifting higher on the lee side where wind deposited it. The main cabin's roof held a growing load that Callum measured weekly with a marked pole. 18 inches of compressed snow sat on the peaked surface, adding hundreds of pounds of weight to the structure. The tilted cube remained completely clear. Snow would land during storms and slide away before it could compact, leaving surfaces that looked freshly planed. January of 1842 arrived with cold that drove temperatures far below zero for weeks at a time. Callum stayed inside most days, venturing out only to gather firewood and check his limited trap lines. He spent hours in the tilted cube room, which he had furnished with a small desk and chair bolted to the angled floor platform. The large window provided exceptional light even during short winter days. He could see approaching weather systems from the elevated vantage point, watching storms build over distant peaks before they reached the ridge. The winter deepened through February. Snow accumulation exceeded anything Callum had recorded in his 7 years on the ridge. By mid-month, the snowpack measured 6 feet in the clearings and drifted to 10 feet in protected areas. Cabin doors across the ridge were buried, forcing trappers to dig tunnels to exit their structures. Callum's main cabin door was likewise buried, but the tilted cube's entrance remained accessible because its threshold was elevated and the approach stayed clear. On February 23rd, a storm system moved in from the northwest that would become legendary among the trappers who survived it. Snow fell continuously for 4 days. Wind drove it horizontally at times, creating whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to arm's length. Callum remained inside, keeping his fire burning and monitoring the stress on his main cabin's roof through sounds and small movements in the log walls. On the third night of the storm, he heard a crack in the distance that was distinct even through the howling wind. It was the sound of structural failure, wood splintering under impossible load. He could not investigate during the storm, but he knew what it meant. Somewhere on the ridge, a cabin had collapsed. When the storm finally cleared on the 5th day, Callum dug out from his main cabin and made his way along the ridge through snow that was waist-deep in places. 2 miles south, he found Rory Kincaid's cabin destroyed. The roof had failed completely, collapsing inward and rendering the structure uninhabitable. Rory had survived by climbing into his small loft space before the final collapse, then digging himself out through the wreckage. He was shaken but alive, living temporarily in a supply cache built of stone. Spring came late in 1842. The massive snowpack took weeks to melt, turning the ridge into a landscape of running water and mud that persisted into May. As trappers emerged from winter and began moving along the trap lines again, word spread about what had survived and what had failed during the record storms. 3 cabins had suffered roof collapse. 2 more showed severe structural damage that would require rebuilding. Every standing cabin showed stress marks, sagging roof beams, or gaps opened in walls by the weight of snow. Trappers compared damage and discussed whether the ridge was becoming too dangerous for year-round occupation. Then they visited Callum's cabin and saw something that made no sense by conventional understanding. His main cabin showed the same stress as others, roof beams slightly sagged from bearing months of heavy snow load. But the tilted cube attached to it was pristine. Not a single gap had opened in the planks. The structure showed no stress, no settling, no damage at all, and more significantly, the surfaces were bare wood. No snow had remained on the tilted faces long enough to cause any loading whatsoever. Lachlan Muir arrived in early June. He was a Scottish trapper who worked ridges 40 miles north and had heard about Callum's unusual construction. He spent an afternoon examining the tilted cube, walking around it, studying the angles, looking at the connection points where it attached to the main cabin. He asked detailed questions about the cantilever system, the bracing, the weight distribution, and the critical angle that prevented snow accumulation. "You built this because of Dougal," Lachlan said. It was not a question. "Aye," Callum replied. "The angle is what matters? 45 degrees? Near enough. Anything past 40 will shed most snow. 45 is certain." Lachlan asked if he could sketch the design. Callum walked him through the entire system, explaining the counterweight principle, the embedded brackets, the internal bracing with tension rods. He shared the information freely because keeping it secret served no purpose. If the design could help others survive, that mattered more than any claim to invention. By the following winter, 2 other trappers on high ridges had built tilted additions to their cabins. The designs varied based on available materials and building skills. One was a smaller cube, only 6 feet per side. The other was a rectangular room tilted at the same critical angle. Both shared the essential principle: surfaces too steep to hold snow. The technique spread slowly through the trapping community, carried by word of mouth and observation rather than any formal documentation. Trappers began calling them Bairn-style additions, though Callum never promoted the name. Some builders understood the engineering completely and replicated Callum's careful approach to counterbalancing and connection strength. Others built crude approximations that worked adequately because the geometry alone provided significant advantage over conventional roofs. By 1845, 7 cabins across the northern Rockies featured tilted additions. The innovation had spread organically, adopted by men who needed the protection it offered and rejected by those who considered the extra effort unnecessary. The adoption pattern followed practical need rather than popularity. Callum Bairn left the ridge in the spring of 1856. The fur trade had collapsed years earlier, killed by changing fashion and depleted beaver populations. He was 43 years old and had spent nearly half his life in the mountains. The tilted cube cabin had sheltered him through 14 winters without a single structural failure. He sold the property to a prospector named Douglas who was searching for gold in the surrounding creeks. Callum rode west to the Bitterroot Valley in Montana Territory where land was opening to settlement. He filed a homestead claim, built a conventional house with a standard peaked roof, and began farming. The valley received modest snowfall compared to the high ridges. A tilted cube was unnecessary at that elevation. In 1858, he married Moira, a widow from a neighboring homestead. They had no children, but the marriage was steady and practical. Callum worked as a carpenter during seasons when farming was slow, building barns and houses for other settlers. His work was known for being exceptionally sturdy, with careful attention to load distribution and bracing that most frontier carpenters ignored. He never spoke about the tilted cube cabin unless directly asked. When other builders inquired about unusual techniques he used, he explained principles of counterbalance and force distribution in simple terms, never mentioning their origin. To the people in the valley, he was simply a competent carpenter who had once worked as a trapper. Callum died in February of 1873 from pneumonia that developed after working in freezing rain to repair a neighbor's collapsed shed. He was 60 years old. The pastor at his funeral mentioned he had been a mountain man in his youth, but knew no details beyond that. Moira buried him in the settlement cemetery under a simple marker that listed his name and years of birth and death. Nothing on the stone referenced the mountains or the innovation that bore his name among trappers. But on the high ridges, the structures remained. The original tilted cube Callum built stood occupied continuously through the 1860s and 70s. Prospectors, hunters, and eventually a surveying crew used it as shelter. Each occupant marveled at how the tilted addition never accumulated snow while the main cabin's roof required regular clearing during heavy winters. By the 1880s, variations of tilted additions appeared on ridge cabins throughout the northern Rockies. Some were crude approximations built by men who understood the principle but lacked engineering knowledge. Others were sophisticated structures that improved on Callum's original design, using better materials and refined connection methods as they became available. The innovation persisted because it solved a problem that remained constant. Snow accumulated on roofs, weight caused collapse, angled surfaces shed snow before it could build dangerous loads. The geometry was simple. Once someone demonstrated it was possible. The story of how the design emerged was mostly forgotten. Trappers in the 1890s used the term Bairn style without knowing who Bairn had been or why he had built the first tilted cube. The innovation had become separated from its creator, which was perhaps appropriate. Callum had not built it for recognition. He had built it to survive after watching his partner die under a collapsed roof. The structure's persistence was legacy enough, even if his name faded into mountains that no longer remembered him.